Lecture 16, Judy, Dog, World War II. At about 5:30 p.m. on the 26th of June, 1944, a British submariner aboard HMS Truculent leaned into his periscope and called the shot on a ship he knew only as a silhouette in the Malacca Strait off Sumatra. The SS Van Warwick, out of Bulawan, port for Medan on Sumatra's east coast, slid through a Japanese-controlled lane with no POW markings, no Red Cross paint, just the plain geometry of a transport doing its run. In the hold, roughly 700 Allied prisoners, many already hollowed by Glogoa camp outside Medan, felt the first torpedo jar the deck and heard steel start to argue with water. Leading aircraftman Frank Williams, RAF, yanked open a rice sack, grabbed Judy, a liver and white English pointer smuggled aboard after 22 to 25 June whistle drills, and shoved her through an open porthole before the second impact turned ladders into traps. 2 torpedoes don't create a movie fireball, they create a hole where the ship's design used to be, and Van Warwick immediately converted that hole into tilt, flooding, and an escalating shortage of breathable air. Japanese guards shouted from above while prisoners clawed upward, and every move cost more because captivity had already stripped muscle, salt, and coordination. A man who collapses on a hot parade ground drowns fast in a flooded ladder well. Frank kicked a crate loose to clear space, shoved another man toward daylight, and felt his own fine motor control die as carbon dioxide rose and panic tightened the chest. Judy hit the sea first and began swimming without hesitation, because a dog doesn't negotiate with seawater, it just paddles. About 12 minutes after the first hit, the transport slid under, and cargo, timber, and bodies became either flotation or dead weight depending on where you managed to clamp a hand. The Malacca Strait was warm enough to delay hypothermia, which only meant the slower killers, aspiration, exhaustion, salt water in the lungs, had time to work. Frank thrashed in oil-smeared chop with clothing dragging like ballast, and men who couldn't swim tried to climb onto hatch covers, planks, each other, even the dog. Judy zigzagged through wreckage and did what an English pointer can actually do for a drowning adult, make the distance to buoyancy shorter, pushing wood toward hands and towing herself hard enough that a clinging man could be steered to a raft. Accounts later disagree on the tally, 4, 6, up to 10, because nobody takes attendance while swallowing seawater, but the repeated detail is mechanical. She kept going out and coming back. When a panicked grip slid toward her neck, she snapped, twisted free, and drove forward again with the collar that would later be read like a set of coordinates. After roughly 2 hours, Frank's later estimate, measured by cramp and fading light, Japanese escort craft circled back to retrieve survivors. Sailors threw lines, swung boat hooks, and hauled men over gunwales with the briskness of handling cargo, not with the delicacy you use on a body that might still choose to live. The count that emerged was brutal and simple. About 200 prisoners survived, about 500 did not, and the missing were names shouted across bamboo huts in Medan and Singapore that would never answer again. Guards shoved the living into a tighter knot on deck and scanned the water for movement. Judy did not appear with Frank's group, and in the immediate aftermath the men assumed she was gone, because that is what experience teaches you to assume about a dog lost in open ocean after a 12-minute sinking. Years later, when Frank Williams sat with pen and paper, his 1950 memoir was bluntly titled Judy, Prisoner of War. He kept turning the dog's collar in his fingers as if the metal could keep memory honest. The engraving was stubbornly specific, Judy, then, Prisoner of War 81A Glogoa Medan, as if a camp outside Medan were a respectable address. The same strip carried 2 more anchors, not adjectives, the 14th of February, 1942, HMS Grasshopper in the Linga Archipelago, and the 26th of June, 1944, Van Warwick, dates that force you to treat the story as a chain of transport events, not a fable. When he tightened that collar around his palm, he also tightened the range of permissible myth. Steel refuses to behave like inspiration. The People's Dispensary for Sick Animals would later praise courage in the Dickin Medal citation, but the collar's real trick was bureaucratic. It made the dog legible to systems that preferred prisoners to be interchangeable. From inside Truculent, the Malacca Strait in mid-1944 looked like a ledger with currents, Sumatra on one margin, the Malay Peninsula on the other, shipping lanes threaded between them toward Singapore. A navigator penciled bearings while a torpedo officer built a firing solution on a target assumed to be hauling Japanese oil, rubber, rice, or troops. The transport they hit carried POWs but flew no warning, because Japanese prisoner transports were typically unmarked. Advertising captives would have advertised vulnerability, and captives were being treated as labor, not as protected passengers. Hellship survived as the label because survivors needed a word for that logistics. Bodies packed into holds, moved through contested seas, guarded by men who valued schedule and discipline over ventilation and lifeboats. In that system, friendly torpedoes don't require malice, they require only a silhouette and a doctrine that says any transport in that lane is a legitimate target. Balawan's key provided the human side of that doctrine on the 26th of June, 1944, when guards drove columns of thin men toward Van Werwick's hatches and dockworkers shifted crates around them as if prisoners were just another shipment. The captives came out of the Medan area camps, including Glogoa, and they boarded without knowing whether Singapore meant hospital, work detail, or a new kind of death that didn't need jungle. Inside the hold, breath turned into humidity, heat load rose as oxygen fell, so fainting became a predictable outcome, not a moral failure. Japanese discipline worked through counting, heads down, numbers barked, rifle butts ready, and any disruption during embarkation could trigger punishment that malnourished bodies could not physiologically afford. That is why Frank treated a rice sack like protective gear and why Judy rode toward the strait as hidden baggage. The embarkation procedure that moved prisoners efficiently also created the narrow window in which an animal could vanish. The forms and orders that fed Balawan in 1944 began with a different document on the 15th of February, 1942, when Lieutenant General Arthur Percival walked into the Ford factory in Singapore and signed surrender to General Tomoyuki Yamashita. Men who had expected relief stacked rifles, burned papers, and filed into captivity as roughly 80,000 troops and auxiliaries became Japanese prisoners in a single administrative collapse. Japanese officers redirected that mass the way a foreman redirects a labor force, sorting British, Australian, and Indian captives into camps and work parties while the city's docks kept moving oil drums and rice bags as if war were an inventory problem. Once you have that many prisoners, you must feed, house, and above all move them, and movement is where cruelty becomes engineering, trains, lorries, ships, and the friction of transport doing the beating for you. By the time Van Werwick cleared Balawan, the men in her hold were already years deep into the corridor, marked by camp names instead of units. By 1942 and 1943, Japanese administrators had turned Southeast Asia into a grid, Sumatra, Java, Singapore, connected by the same maritime network that carried rubber and fuel, and prisoners moved along it with the indifferent efficiency of freight. A clerk could stamp a transfer in Medan, a guard could march a man to Balawan, a ship's master could lock a hatch, and by nightfall the prisoner would be sweating in darkness under a deck that didn't care which empire he served. Camp counts became rituals, lines, bowed heads, numbers recited, rifles angled as reminders, and the point was compliance under surveillance rather than accuracy. In that ritual an unregistered dog was a problem because she couldn't answer to a number, and problems get solved with a stick. Judy survived because prisoners learned to treat paperwork as a weapon. If something is on a list, it must be accounted for, and in a camp that loophole could force a guard to argue with his own system before he acted. At Glogoa camp outside Medan, the moment Judy became real to the Japanese system played out like a petty office transaction, except the currency was a puppy and the stakes were life. Frank Williams arrived around August 1942 as a leading aircraftman of the Royal Air Force, already thin enough that every spoon of rice had moral weight, and he met Judy after she stole from his ration in the way hungry animals and hungry men both steal. Instead of hitting her or chasing her off, he fed her, then kept feeding her until, my dog, became a fact enforced by habit and by the silent agreement of other prisoners who wanted the comfort too. The commandant, Colonel Bono, remembered in some accounts as Suzuki Bono, could have ended it with a gesture, but Frank found the lever the camp offered, registration. When Judy produced a litter in late 1942, he used one puppy as a bribe and Bono signed papers assigning her the service number, 81A. A laughable category error that nonetheless compelled guards to treat her as something that had to be counted. June 1944 was when that fragile loophole collided with an officer who didn't care about lists. Captain Nishi, overseeing the Medan prisoners slated for transfer, issued a simple order: the dog stayed behind, and in a camp where animals were often killed on sight, stayed behind, translated cleanly into execution. Frank responded by turning concealment into procedure, and between the 22nd and the 25th of June he and his comrades, including another RAF man, leading aircraftman Leonard Walter Williams, drilled Judy to hop into a rice sack on a low whistle and stay silent through parade ground counts. They tested it in blazing heat with guards reciting numbers and rifle butts tapping impatience into dirt, and the dog held still because the cue was familiar and the punishment for noise was written into the prisoner's posture. When the column moved toward Balawan on the 26th of June, the sack became luggage and the luggage became a life raft in advance, the only way Judy could reach Van Werwick without a guard noticing the extra lungs. A rice sack and a whistle sound like improvisations, but they sit on top of an older pattern. Judy had been disappearing and reappearing since she was small enough to fit under a market stall. In February 1936, Shanghai dog kennels registered a litter of 7 English pointer puppies, liver and white, and one of them carried the name Judy before she ever wore a navy collar. At around 3 months old she slipped away. Some retellings blame the chaos of Japanese sailors trying to seize a pretty pup, others simply describe a puppy vanishing into the city, and she survived for roughly 3 months as a street dog, nosing through alley garbage and learning that hunger has no sentimentality. A Chinese shopkeeper eventually picked her up and brought her back to the kennels, returning pedigree to a body that had already learned scavenger arithmetic. When the Royal Navy later wrote, Judy of Sussex, on forms, the ink tried to overwrite the streets, the dog kept the streets anyway. Autumn 1936 brought Lieutenant Commander J. Waldegrave and Chief Petty Officer Charles Geordie Jeffrey off HMS Nat and into the Shanghai kennels with the casual certainty of men who assume empires are permanent. Nat, an insect-class river gunboat on the China station, was built to nose along the Yangtze on shallow draft, and the officers wanted a mascot the way ships often want mascots, as morale procurement disguised as tradition. They chose the 6-month-old Judy, renamed her Judy, and filed Royal Navy paperwork listing her as Judy of Sussex, supposedly after her mother, as if an English county could be stapled to a dog born in a treaty port. Able seaman Jan Tanky Cooper, the ship's butcher, lifted the pup under one arm and carried her up the gangway, turning a living animal into ship's stores by the simple act of bringing her aboard. On deck she sniffed rope tar, hot paint, diesel, and river mud, then followed Cooper's boots toward shade because a steel deck in Shanghai sun teaches thermodynamics instantly. Shipboard life trained Judy by friction rather than by intention, and the men reinforced it with 1,000 small corrections, shooing her from machinery spaces, dragging her back from ladders, tossing scraps as bribes because a hungry dog is a negotiator with teeth. In November 1936, only weeks after she arrived, she wandered forward at night and tumbled off Nat's forecastle into the Yangtze, a river with strong currents that doesn't care about pedigree or panic. Jeffrey raised the alarm, the gunboat executed an emergency stop, and a motor launch dropped into the dark water to retrieve what the logbook dryly recorded as a man overboard drill. Someone hauled the shivering dog over the gunwale and Cooper wrapped her in whatever cloth was at hand because wet animals lose heat faster than humans expect in humid air. The crew had already proved they would interrupt naval routine to save her, and she had already proved she could keep her airway clear under stress. During the 1937 to 1938 Yangtze patrol years, with Nat moored in darkness, river pirates tried to creep close using the river's own noise as camouflage. Humans on watch fail in patterned ways, fatigue narrows attention, lantern light ruins night vision, and the brain edits faint irregular sounds as probably nothing until probably becomes a blade. Judy didn't make those compromises. She lifted her head, growled, and then detonated into barking that dragged sailors out of hammocks and onto deck with rifles and curses. The pirates, now exposed by movement and alertness, lost the stealth they needed and backed off into the river before boarding could become murder or theft. What the crew learned was instrumentation. A dog's hearing reaches higher frequencies than a man's, and a dog's nose reads diesel, sweat, tobacco, and unfamiliar bodies against the ship's usual scent map. On a shore outing near Zhejiang, Kukiang in the older British spelling, Judy turned from mascot into early warning with a tug hard enough to rearrange a man's route. Jeffrey walked her along a path expecting mud and mosquitoes, not a big cat, and he only noticed the leopard when the dog planted her paws and refused to go forward. The animal sat far enough away to be pattern rather than spectacle, and that distance is how predators survive around armed humans. You only see them when you're allowed to. Judy's refusal forced Jeffrey to look up, and looking up is often the whole difference between a story and a casualty report in Riverside Scrub where sound is absorbed and sight lines are broken. He backed away with the leash tight and returned to the boat, leaving the leopard as a quiet fact that didn't care about British uniforms. Early December 1937 brought a friendly visit to the American gunboat USS Panay on the Yangtze and, because sailors are incapable of leaving well enough alone, an international incident made of fur and brass. Judy was left aboard Panay when Nat cast off, and the Americans initially denied having her when signaled, either genuinely confused or enjoying the leverage. The British response was immediate and physical. Someone unbolted Panay's ship's bell, hauled the heavy metal across, and stowed it on Nat as hostage until the dog was returned. By the next morning Judy was back and the bell went home, a prank that sounds harmless until you remember that Panay would be sunk later that same month by Japanese aircraft, announcing how fragile, neutral, really was on the river. Judy's lesson was purely practical: wander far enough and a ship will move hardware to get you back. Hankou in early 1938 turned Judy's social life into a supply problem when sailors staged an impromptu wedding between her and a French gunboat's pointer named Paul. They performed the ceremony with the solemnity of men who will invent any excuse for a party, then watched biology arrive on schedule. Around mid-1938 Judy produced 13 puppies, and 10 survived long enough to be handed out to French and American crews like Furry Alliance tokens. Someone had to find extra scraps, rig makeshift bedding, and keep a litter alive on a ship where deck space also hosted ropes, ammunition, and sweat, so even the cute story is really about logistics. The puppies left one by one, carried down gangways in sailors' arms, and Judy learned that attachment can be temporary even when it feels absolute. By October 1938, after what later sources describe as a diplomatic kerfuffle involving her behavior ashore, somewhere between commotion and biting, depending on who tells it, command drew a line and banned her from further shore leave. The crew initially tried to give their ship's dog a respectable job title, which in the Royal Navy means you pretend fun is training. On shore bird hunts they expected pointer work, nose down, freeze on scent, hold steady at a gunshot, retrieve on whistle, but Judy treated the exercise as an excuse to sprint and then lobby for food. Chief Petty Officer Charles Jeffrey finally wrote the assessment that killed the fantasy in a log entry dated the 11th of June, 1937. Our chances of making her a trained gun dog are very small, blaming willfulness and a talent for pointing only when dinner was involved. Waldegrave could laugh in his diary, but Cooper still had to stop a dog from sliding under boots on deck or following interesting smells into places where gears and hot metal don't forgive curiosity. The training pivoted from hunting to shipcraft. Judy learned the difference between a bosun's whistle and an angry shout, learned which ladders were safe, and learned that the galley door is both promise and hazard because cooks defend it like territory. Then the war in China changed the soundtrack. As the Second Sino-Japanese War erupted in 1937 and Japanese aircraft began to use the Yangtze as a stage for intimidation, Judy's most useful training arrived through her ears. When fighters or bombers flew low over Chinese water, the first signal was often not a visible shape but a faint vibration and a high whine above a tired sailor's hearing range, and Judy responded by snapping her head up and barking at a patch of empty-looking sky. Lookouts raised binoculars, officers cursed at false alarms, and then, often enough to matter, the plane appeared, proving the dog had been hearing the approach all along. On a gunboat with limited radar and no desire to be the center of anyone's air plan, that early bark functioned like extra minutes, letting men get under cover or bring guns to readiness instead of being caught mid-deck with hands full of nothing. Keeping a dog alive on a small warship was never sentimental, it was a daily series of interventions performed by men who were also maintaining guns, radios, and their own sleep debt. Cooper set water buckets where a roll wouldn't tip them, dragged Judy into shade when steel deck plates turned hot enough to burn pads, and blocked her from machinery spaces where one wrong step could mean a crushed paw in a world without veterinary care. He let her run because confinement spikes stress and makes animals unpredictable, then grabbed her collar when a sudden lurch turned play into a slide toward a bulkhead. As Singapore tightened in late 1941 and stores came under pressure, he managed her diet inside rationing, because a ship preparing to fight and flee can't feed a mascot on scraps alone. The galley's reliable foods, rice, hard biscuit, tinned meat, kept sailors functional, but for a pointer they meant constant bargaining over protein, hydration, and enough calories to regulate body temperature in tropical humidity. June 1939 brought a reassignment that looked like routine and behaved like fate. Part of Nat's crew and their dog walked their kit across a dock and boarded HMS Grasshopper, another insect-class gunboat. Sailors lowered gear into a different hull and watched Judy hesitate at the gangway the way any animal hesitates when the smells change and the map in her head goes blank. Then Cooper's hand closed on her collar and translated "new ship" into "still my people." When Britain declared war on Germany in September 1939, Grasshopper's orders and radio traffic pulled her toward Singapore, and the deck that had once faced Chinese pirates began rehearsing for a different enemy. Judy paced and listened, building a new catalogue of sounds, heavier engines, more drills, more urgency in officers' voices when news arrived. The move on paper had shifted her from Chinese rivers into the path of the Japanese advance, and the path was already darkening. On the morning of the 8th of December, 1941 in Singapore, hours after Pearl Harbor by US clocks, but on the same expanding front by local time, Grasshopper's world turned vertical as the threat moved from riverbanks to sky. Lookouts squinted into glare, because tropical brightness hides aircraft until they are close enough for bombs to make introductions, and the ship's anti-aircraft guns were useless unless someone started the scramble early. Judy did what she had been doing since the Yangtze years. She cocked her ears, lifted her head, and fired a hard bark at empty air, forcing sailors to look where their own senses hadn't yet offered permission. Men ran to stations, hands on ladders and ammunition boxes, and officers snapped orders that translated "maybe" into "move," because in air raids warning time is measured in minutes and mistakes. When Japanese bombs hit the port, the air became a machine for dropping metal through humidity, and Judy kept barking at the part of the sky that still hadn't arrived. In that moment the crew stopped treating her reactions as entertainment, because a dog doesn't raise false alarms for reputation, and on a ship the difference between drill and strike is often whether you believe the first cue. That bark changed how men behaved in their own bodies, shoulders tightened, eyes tracked higher, and hands that would have kept cleaning or cooking moved toward guns and cover. On a small ship like Grasshopper, human perception is easily fooled by fatigue and routine. The brain edits out distant engine noise the same way it edits out the constant thrum of your own pumps, until it is too late. Judy's nervous system didn't carry the same filters, so when she oriented to a sound, a sailor could treat it as an external warning threshold and act before his own hearing admitted there was anything to hear. Someone swung a searchlight, someone yelled for more ammunition, and someone else hauled the dog back from the rail so she wouldn't be thrown when the ship shuddered under concussions. The mechanism is brutally physical. A dog's auditory range and pattern detection can by seconds, and seconds on deck can be the difference between being prone behind steel and being upright in the open when fragments arrive. By late 1941, the line between mascot and crew member was being redrawn with every bark that sent men moving. After the all clear on the 8th of December, 1941, sailors dragged hoses across Grasshopper's deck, washed down bomb dust, and ran fingers over fresh dents in the paint to locate sharp edges before they turned into infections. Judy nosed the scuppers, sneezed at cordite, and then followed Cooper back toward the galley, because a dog returns to food and familiar boots even when humans are still replaying the sound. In the wardroom, an officer unfolded a signal sheet, read out the next instruction, and watched men carry ammunition boxes and kit to positions that had been practice the week before. Somewhere ashore in Singapore, a clerk stamped another movement order that would push this little gunboat deeper into the geometry of Japanese expansion, the same kind of document that had already sent prisoners from Medan to Bulawan 2 years later. Cooper clipped his fingers through Judy's collar as the harbour sirens started again, and the dog leaned toward the noise like it was her job. That kind of alertness is exactly why navies have been making the same reckless trade for centuries. A crew lets an animal pace the planks, and in exchange the animal's nervous system becomes one more sensor bolted to the ship. On the 8th of December, 1941 in Singapore's Keppel Harbour, Judy doesn't argue a case, she throws her head up, barks, and forces men on HMS Grasshopper to move mugs off tables and bodies off benches before their eyes have even decided what they're seeing. Sailors answer by doing what sailors always do under threat. They touch gear, shove hatches, and run the short distances between routine and action stations like the deck itself is on fire. The mechanism isn't mystical. A dog catches cues, tone shifts in engines, pressure changes, the faint approach of machines through humid air, then converts them into noise that makes humans look up. The bargain is also brutally simple. If the animal is wrong or panics, it still moves men, and movement is sometimes the only defense a thin-hulled river gunboat has. Back in Britain in 1942, the state tries to make that bargain legible by turning dogs into a program. The War Dog School takes civilian animals, clips leads onto collars, and drills them into guard duty, patrol work, mine detection, and message runs until obedience is muscle memory instead of hope. Instructors tug a leash to set a heel, slap a flank to cue a sit, and watch a dog's nose sweep ground that humans would never bother to read, because the whole point is to outsource detection to an organ you didn't evolve. The Ministry of Defence later estimates about 3,500 dogs were employed across British forces in the Second World War, and that number implies infrastructure, handlers assigned, feed sourced, injuries treated, a chain of decisions that keeps an animal functional when humans are barely functional themselves. Those war dogs are official, in the way institutions mean it. They have a role the paperwork can understand, and the role tells people how to behave around them. Judy's problem is that she's about to walk into the war without the paperwork, like a tool with no manual and no warranty. Across the same years, other militaries run their own versions of the deal, and you can see the hardware converge even when the uniforms don't. In the Pacific, US Marines put Dobermans and other dogs on jungle trails and night perimeters, and a handler tightens a grip on the line when the dog's ears flick forward, because that flick is data. A dog moves low, stops, sniffs, and the man behind it stops too, not out of romance but because getting ambushed on a coral island has a short learning curve. The procedure is consistent whether you call it scouting or sentry. The human uses the dog's senses, then uses the dog's body language as a trigger for a practiced response. Halt, spread out, go quiet, reroute. In the Far East, though, that system is thin on the ground compared to Europe. There are fewer dedicated dog units and more improvisation, which means the animals that show up in stories are often the ones that weren't supposed to be there at all. On a Royal Navy small craft in Southeast Asia, the dog is usually not a state asset, it's a ship's fact, like rust or damp. Someone in Singapore in 1941 stands on a wharf with a clipboard while a port health officer stamps quarantine paperwork and glances at the gangway the way bureaucracy always glances at a gangway, looking for excuses to say no. A sailor answers by sliding a dog behind a coil of hawser, palm pressed flat against her ribs to keep her still, because you can't explain morale to a man whose job is rabies control. The ship runs two rulebooks at once, Admiralty regulations in the ledger, and superstition in the bones of the crew, the old belief that a mascot is luck until it becomes liability. Every time the dog stays aboard, it's because somebody with hands and rank decides to treat the rules as flexible, and because nobody has yet been forced to write down what happens if the dog bites. That flexibility has roots. On the China station in the 1930s, gunboats and river craft carry small crews through Shanghai, the Yangtze, and treaty port routines where boredom and danger trade shifts, and a mascot becomes a piece of social technology. A sailor buys a dog in a port market, ties a bit of cord around its neck, and brings it aboard because rats chew stores and men chew each other when the only entertainment is waiting. The dog earns its keep by killing vermin, taking scraps without complaint, and giving the crew something alive to fuss over that isn't their own fear. Even big ships play the game. HMS Prince of Wales carried a dog named Bobby, and men stroked him on deck in the same era when battleships were being sunk by bombs and torpedoes. None of this is cuddly once you treat it as logistics. Every extra mouth requires calories, every animal requires water, and every habit becomes a risk when the war arrives and makes the old indulgences expensive. Now push that tradition through Japanese captivity, and it breaks in ways nobody has a precedent for handling. In Sumatra in 1942, a guard can look at a dog and see three things at once: disease carrier, nuisance, potential food, and none of those categories include protected. Prisoners drag Judy under a platform with raw hands, not because they believe in pets but because they understand the logic of a camp. Visibility invites decisions, and decisions are often lethal. The men themselves are running on a daily ration often summarized as 600 to 800 calories of mostly rice, and a medium-sized dog needs roughly 1,000 or more to maintain weight in the tropics even before parasites and wounds start taxing the system. So every time a man tears off a piece of his own rice ball and pushes it toward Judy's mouth, he's not performing sentiment, he's transferring fuel under scarcity. He is also creating evidence, because a fed dog leaves tracks, sheds hair, and stays alive long enough for a guard to notice her again. The weirdest part is that the world keeps trying to file this under normal. The collar that ends up preserved at the Imperial War Museum is heavy with tags, things like a PDSA Allied Forces Mascot Club number, 1180, and even a Tail Waggers Club medallion. Objects that clink like someone tried to solve starvation with membership categories. Somebody, somewhere, punches holes in metal and threads ribbon through it, because institutions can't metabolize chaos unless it becomes a badge. But in 1942 the only badge that matters is whether the dog can pass as invisible on demand, and whether the men can keep their own faces neutral while doing it. The comedy of the tags comes later. In the camp, the joke is always one bad timing away from a beating. In London in 1946, far from Medan and the Linga Islands, a clerk at the People's Dispensary for Sick Animals sits at a desk and turns Judy's war into a paragraph by typing dates as if they are rivets. Fingers hit keys, carbon paper darkens, a citation makes the 14th of February, 1942, the 16th of February 1942, and, Medan, into clean anchors that a post-war audience can hold without tasting bilge water. A stamp comes down, ink spreads, and suddenly 4 years of improvisation look like an orderly service record, because paper is the only technology humans have for pretending they understand what they survived. That citation doesn't create the story, it trims it, and the trimming matters because it hides the part where keeping a dog alive required dozens of small, exhausting actions by men who were barely keeping themselves alive. Back in 1942, the dog doesn't get a paragraph, she gets whatever a sailor can do with 2 hands and a thin margin of time. Before that margin turns into triage, care aboard HMS Nat is the kind sailors actually trust, routine assigned to a specific person so it doesn't dissolve into everybody's problem and therefore nobody's. Able seaman Jan, Tanky, Cooper, the butcher, uses a knife for what it's meant for, cutting meat, and then uses the same knife to shave off scraps that he flicks toward Judy with the casual aim of a man feeding a system he wants stable. He wedges an open box under a bench, packs it with a blanket, and makes a crude bed that won't skid across a damp deck when the boat turns, because a dog that never sleeps becomes a dog that snaps. Lieutenant Commander J. Waldegrave's permission sits in the background like a legal fiction, and Chief Petty Officer Charles Jeffreys' seniority sits in the foreground like the real authority. The kind that decides whether a problem gets solved or punished. Even conflict becomes procedural. When Chinese cooks on board don't want a dog underfoot near knives and boiling pots, sailors physically block her path and enforce boundaries, because a galley is a machine full of sharp mistakes. On HMS Grasshopper in Singapore between 1939 and February 1942, the same care problem mutates because the environment is harder on canine anatomy than human sentiment admits. A small gunboat is a vertical maze, hot ladders, narrow companionways, slick patches of oil, and a pointer's pads are not designed for tropical steel that has been baking under equatorial sun. Men solve it the only way they can. They dump fresh water into a bucket, drag it into shade, and push the rim toward Judy's muzzle before she laps salt water off the deck and makes herself sicker. They lift her over a ladder rather than let her scramble and slip, and they learn to read panting as an engineering constraint, because high humidity makes evaporative cooling inefficient and heat stress becomes a real threat in minutes. The dog's body becomes one more thing the crew monitors, like engine temperature or fuel, and when her ribs show, they don't need a lecture on metabolism, they need calories. As supplies tighten in late 1941, feeding turns into arithmetic that feels obscene precisely because it's so normal. A sailor cracks a hard biscuit, palms half of it, then hesitates before handing it over, because he knows the ship's stores are finite and Singapore's situation is collapsing. Someone scoops rice, someone opens a tin, someone pretends not to see the transfer, because discipline survives on plausible deniability. Protein matters in ways men don't talk about out loud. It supports wound healing, immune function, and the muscle needed to swim or run when the time comes, and the time is coming fast in February 1942. Judy can't negotiate her ration, so humans do it through theft and sharing, and every stolen mouthful makes the dog more visible and the men more at risk. The procedure keeps her moving. It also ties her fate to the crew's willingness to keep violating small rules in advance of big disasters. The disaster arrives on the 14th of February, 1942 when Japanese aircraft find HMS Grasshopper and HMS Dragonfly as the ships try to move people out of the Singapore collapse zone. And the solution the captain chooses is blunt: beach the ship in the Lingga region rather than let her sink outright. Men leap, slide, and haul themselves across a deck that is suddenly smoke and heat, and Judy gets left behind in the chaos because chaos doesn't have a dog checkbox. Petty Officer George White climbs back aboard anyway, boots hitting planks that are already damaged, and he follows sound into the wreck's interior the way a mechanic follows a rattle. He hears a whimper under a row of lockers, shoves the metal aside, and drags a wounded dog into his arms while the ship still smells like burning paint and cordite. When he gets her out, he doesn't have a stretcher. He uses improvisation. He loads her onto a makeshift raft and ferries her to shore because a pointer can't swim well with an injury and a panicked mouthful of seawater. On the island, survival becomes a series of bad options arranged by weather. The group, often remembered as around 90 men from Grasshopper and Dragonfly, sometimes described as more than 100 when you count civilians and strays from the chaos, drags wreckage up past the tide line and builds shade with sailcloth and boards because in the tropics, sun is a weapon. Men tear cloth into bandages, press it against Judy's wounds, and then press the same cloth against their own skin, because there's no sterile supply and infection doesn't care whose blood it is. They keep her from drinking seawater by grabbing her collar when she lunges toward the surf, because salt water accelerates dehydration and vomiting and the dog can't be reasoned with once her mouth is dry. Singapore surrenders on the 15th of February, 1942, but the news isn't what's killing them, it's the absence of fresh water and the slow narrowing of judgment that comes with thirst. They are sitting on a strip of sand in the Lingga archipelago while an empire folds elsewhere, and the first thing that collapses inside the body is not courage but fluid balance. By about the 16th of February, 1942, the men can feel their own systems failing in boring, measurable ways: tongue swelling, urine darkening, headaches that turn into confusion, and Judy's behavior starts to look less like nuisance and more like the only remaining sensor on the island. She noses the ground, circles, and then suddenly runs, and a handful of men follow because at that point any motion feels like an experiment worth the energy. Leading aircraftman Leonard W. Williams later pins this to memory in interviews. Judy disappears, then is found digging at a spot where water can be scooped, and the report matters because it's anchored in the kind of detail trauma usually erases. The dog scratches at sand with front paws until the surface darkens, and the men drop to their knees and start clawing alongside her, using hands, bits of metal, anything that can move earth. When moisture beads up in the hole, nobody applauds, they deepen it, because the mechanism only works if the lens of fresh water isn't instantly contaminated by feet, sweat, and seawater. A sailor tastes the first seepage like a chemist without a lab, letting a drop hit his tongue and deciding whether he's just drunk brine. The reason it works is geography and density, not magic. Rainwater percolates through sand, floats above heavier salt water, and forms a thin, fragile lens that can be reached if you dig in the right place and don't punch through into the ocean below. Judy's nose doesn't need to understand that, it just needs to detect cooler dampness, faint mineral differences, or the scent of moisture trapped under hot sand, then keep digging when humans would stop. The men turn her behavior into a resource by enlarging the hole, shoring the edges with scraps so it doesn't collapse, and assigning guards to keep bodies and boots away. A water source on an island is not comfort, it's time measured in hours until rescue, and the hole is suddenly the most valuable piece of infrastructure any of them have. They ration the water with the grim politeness of people who know what happens when desperate bodies rush a single tap. Someone dips a tin mug, passes it hand to hand, and watches for the first man who tries to drink too fast, because rapid rehydration after severe dehydration can trigger vomiting and cramps, and vomiting is a waste they can't afford. Men fill canteens if they have them, and if they don't, they improvise containers out of whatever the wreck left, bottles, tins, even folded canvas, because storage turns minutes into days. Judy tries to drink until her belly is full, and hands pull her back and offer smaller amounts, because a dog's urgency can outpace its gut. The guards on the hole aren't guarding it from enemies, they're guarding it from the group's own panic and from the tide that wants to salt the whole thing back into uselessness. In this moment, the hero act is not the digging alone, it's the conversion of digging into controlled distribution under stress. Rescue, when it comes around the 20th of February, 1942, arrives the way rescue often does in coastal chaos, imperfect, local, and good enough. Men light a fire or wave cloth, and a small vessel, described in some accounts as a Chinese boat, in others as a Dutch patrol craft, edges toward the shore because even sympathetic strangers have to decide whether the risk is worth it. Survivors wade out and shove, hands under hull, guiding the boat through shallows while their legs shake from exhaustion and salt sores. They lift Judy aboard like cargo that happens to breathe, because an injured dog can't climb a gunwale and the sea doesn't care about sentiment. The boat carries them to Singkep, then towards Sumatra, and the geography matters because every mile shifts the risk profile, from thirst to jungle to capture. The island bought time, now time has to be spent moving before the Japanese net closes completely. On Sumatra, the story turns into feet and miles. Groups trek roughly 200 miles across the island over 4 to 5 weeks, cutting through jungle and skirting rivers, because roads are either controlled or non-existent and the men are trying to stay ahead of enemy patrols with bodies already compromised by dehydration and wounds. Judy stays with them, limping, scavenging, and sometimes hunting small animals or vermin when she can, because a pointer is built to search and move and will keep searching even when underfed. Along the Indragiri River, a crocodile attack appears in the recollections as a sudden violence that leaves Judy with deep gashes and the men with one more problem that can't be solved by courage alone. They wash her wounds with whatever water they can risk, wrap cloth tight enough to slow bleeding, and keep her moving because stopping in the wrong place means getting surrounded. Infection is the invisible clock on everything. Tropical heat accelerates bacterial growth, parasites weaken immunity, and every scratch becomes a potential fever. And the men are now performing field medicine on a dog while also performing it on themselves. They reach Padang in March 1942 and find the timetable has already snapped shut. Accounts describe the particular gut punch of arriving a day after the last ship has left, standing on a shore that no longer offers escape, and watching Japanese troops close in until surrender stops being a choice and becomes a description of what happens next. Men raise hands, drop whatever weapons they still have, and get searched, because capture is a procedure and procedures are how empires do violence without feeling it. Judy doesn't understand surrender, she reads body language and fear, so she stays near the group, and the men have to decide in seconds whether to risk keeping her visible. They choose the dangerous option again, because by this point Judy isn't a mascot, she's been welded into the group's survival logic, and abandoning her feels like cutting out a sensor mid-operation. That decision doesn't make them noble, it makes the next steps harder. Japanese transport takes them north through Bulawan port toward Medan and Camp No. 1 at Glogoa, and the men solve visibility with the oldest smuggling method in the world, hide the thing inside something nobody wants to inspect closely. Someone holds open a rice sack, guides Judy's front paws inside, and folds the coarse fabric up around her chest while she pants, because a bag is a sauna and a dog cools itself by moving air over a wet tongue. A knot gets tied, the sack gets hoisted, and the carrier adjusts the weight on his shoulder to keep her from sliding and panicking, because a struggling animal makes noise and noise becomes evidence. The sack is not a magic trick, it's a sensory prison where airflow drops, odors concentrate, and the dog has to suppress the instinct to whine when the world turns into darkness and motion. The men refine the technique by repetition and timing, consistent cues, quick release, reward with food, until bag becomes a learned route to survival instead of a trigger for terror. At Glogoa outside Medan, the camp itself forces a new kind of choreography, roll calls, inspections, punishment drills, and a daily rhythm designed to exhaust bodies into obedience. Judy slips between barracks and fence lines like a problem the system can't fully close out, ribs showing, coat dull, eyes still scanning because a pointer's brain doesn't stop processing even when its stomach is empty. Other prisoners chase her away from scraps because hunger makes ethics feel optional, and the dog's very existence threatens to split solidarity into factions over food. Guard tolerance, when it appears, is not kindness, it's a narrow rule that can vanish with a change of personnel or a bad mood, and the men learn to treat, aloud, as a temporary state. They keep her alive by doing dozens of small things that don't look heroic from a distance, slipping rice from bowls, pulling thorns from pads, picking ticks off ears, and dragging her out of sight when boots approach. Each act is a tiny time bomb because being caught sheltering an animal can be punished, but letting her die would be a different kind of loss, both emotional and operational. The record gives a clean hinge in August 1942 when a Royal Air Force leading aircraftman named Frank Williams arrives in the Medan camp system and meets Judy as a starving presence instead of a story. Judy makes the first move with the blunt logic of a hungry animal. She goes for the most valuable object in the camp, a man's rice ration, and snatches at it because calories are the only moral currency her body recognizes. Frank's hands close around the rice ball for a second, and the predictable reaction in a place like Glogoa is violence, kicking the dog away, shouting, establishing ownership through force. He chooses a different action that changes the future. He breaks off part of his own portion and pushes it toward her mouth, then watches her chew like a machine restarting. That transfer is small in mass and huge in consequence, because it turns Judy from a general camp nuisance into a specific responsibility, and responsibilities become systems when you repeat them. Frank builds the bond the way he builds everything in captivity, by making it routine enough that fear can't disrupt it every time. He whistles softly and pats the ground, not to be cute but to create a cue that can cut through chaos, and Judy starts to associate that sound with safety and food rather than with punishment. He runs fingers along her ribs, checks for new sores, and plucks parasites from her coat with nails because lice and ticks are not abstract discomfort in the tropics, they are vectors, they weaken, and they make wounds fester. When he shares water, he does it in controlled amounts because a dehydrated animal will gorge and vomit, and vomiting is lost fluid and lost electrolytes they can't replace. The physiology under the touch is real. Predictable contact can lower stress responses, stabilize breathing, and make sleep possible in bursts, and sleep is when bodies repair what the day breaks. In a camp where malaria and dysentery are endemic and medical care is scarce, a calmer nervous system is not philosophy, it's risk reduction. Judy also becomes a working sensor again, but the camp forces her to change the output. A full bark that might have been merely annoying on a ship becomes lethal attention in Medan, so the warning has to get quieter, a stiffening posture, a head snap toward a gate, a low growl swallowed before it turns into noise. Men learn to read that microsignal and respond within seconds by hiding contraband, straightening posture, wiping faces blank, and moving Judy behind bunks before a guard rounds the corner. When a warning prevents even one beating, it prevents injuries that would become infections in humid filth, where a split lip or bruised rib can progress toward pneumonia or sepsis in a body already compromised by hunger. Sometimes Judy's intervention is direct and dangerous. Accounts describe her darting toward a guard who is striking a collapsed prisoner, snapping or growling in a way that redirects attention, and then taking the blow meant for a man. Comedy evaporates in those moments, a rifle but doesn't care whether the target has 2 legs or 4. Keeping her alive still hinges on concealment, and concealment in a prison camp is mostly about engineering the dog's senses against itself. A pointer is a mobile nose with legs. She will sniff, sneeze, whine, and pant at exactly the wrong time if you treat her like an object instead of a nervous system. So Frank and other prisoners turn the rice sack trick into a rehearsed procedure. He holds the sack open, gives the same signal, and Judy steps in because repetition has trained the sequence into reflex. He ties the top loosely enough to preserve airflow, braces the sack against his thigh to keep her from sliding, and counts time because heat builds fast inside coarse fabric in Sumatra. The dog has to suppress panic and noise, and that suppression only works if the humans release her quickly and reward the behavior consistently, because a dog learns through consequence, not through moral instruction. Every successful hide is a proof of life for the whole system. Every failed hide becomes evidence for guards who need only one reason. Feeding stays ugly and constant. With POW rations around 600 to 800 calories a day, mostly rice, the men are already starving on paper, and a dog's energy needs don't negotiate with paper. They supplement with whatever the camp environment can be bullied into giving up. Rats caught near stores, scraps traded, the occasional bit of fat or fish if a guard can be bribed or ignored. And Judy's own hunting becomes part of the equation whether anyone likes it or not. Parasites and tropical disease add invisible taxes. A worm load steals nutrients, a skin infection burns calories, and a wound that won't close becomes a slow leak of protein and immune function. Frank watches her gait, massages a paw to find a thorn, and then forces himself to give her food even when his own hands shake, because a weakened dog loses the ability to warn and to comfort, and then the whole human-animal loop collapses. The absurdity is that affection is now a supply chain, one that runs through a rice bowl and a pair of hands. Late 1942 brings the kind of development that sounds impossible until you remember biology is stubborn. Judy gives birth to 5 puppies inside the Medan camp system. For that to happen, a female dog has to survive long enough, eat enough, and be sheltered enough to cycle and whelp under the same malnutrition regime that is killing men with dysentery and malaria, which tells you how much unseen maintenance is already happening around her. Prisoners improvise a nest with rags and boards, shield the litter from guards' eyes, and then confront the grim math of feeding more mouths when they can barely feed one. Accounts suggest the puppy's fate was mostly bleak, lost, dead, or removed, with one puppy becoming the only one that matters because it becomes currency. Frank approaches the camp commandant, often identified as Colonel Bono, sometimes labeled Suzuki in summaries, and instead of pleading with words alone, he offers the puppy as a gift that fits the commandant's world, an animal as status, as entertainment, as leverage. The bribe works because camps are run by humans, and humans have weaknesses even when they carry authority. A Japanese clerk brings out a ledger, a pen scratches paper, and Judy is officially registered as a prisoner of war with the service number 81A. A bureaucratic move so strange it sounds like folklore until you imagine the actual mechanics. Ink, signature, the weight of a stamp, the quiet moment when a guard has to pretend a dog is now a category. The number doesn't feed her, doesn't heal her, and doesn't stop a baton in mid-swing, but it changes the argument that has to happen inside a guard's head before he kills her. Frank threads tags onto her collar, fingers working fast, and the metal sits against her neck like a tiny shield made of paperwork. Men look at the collar and see something they can point to if challenged, because in a system that worships lists, being on a list is a kind of armor. It's thin armor, and it requires constant upkeep, and the next inspection is always coming. Judy slid her muzzle under the lip of a rice ration at Glogo, a camp outside Medan in August 1942, and tested the burlap with her teeth the way a locksmith tests a door. A man who'd been hungry long enough to count grains as units of power could have kicked her off on reflex, and plenty would have, because hunger trains violence like a drill sergeant. Frank Williams didn't kick, he pinched off part of his own portion with 2 fingers and held it out low, palm open, letting an undernourished English pointer decide whether this strange new human was a threat or a food source. When she took the rice and didn't bolt, he used the only currency the camp reliably respected, calories, to buy the first inch of a partnership that would later survive rifles, paperwork, quarantine law, and the slow rot of memory. Williams tightened that inch into a routine by doing something very British and very lethal. He made it boring. He fed Judy in the same spot near the huts, at the same hour when roll calls eased and the guards' attention drifted toward their own meals, and he used repetition to teach her that stillness produced food and noise produced danger. In a camp where Japanese sentries carried rifles and enforced order with beatings, he turned his hands into a quiet signal system. 2 fingers down for stay, a flat palm for wait, a short hiss to suppress a whine before it became an alarm. Every day he watched for failure modes, a bark when a guard shouted, a sudden lunge at a rat, panting that spiked when the tropical heat trapped itself under her coat. He couldn't correct those with kindness alone, so he corrected them with timing, reward immediately after silence, touch as a substitute for a treat when he had nothing left, and withdrawal of contact when she got jittery, because dogs read attention as strongly as they read meat. That procedural mindset didn't appear out of nowhere, it arrived with his uniform. Frank Williams was a Royal Air Force leading aircraftman, an enlisted rank that sits far below the people who give speeches and far above the people who are allowed to admit they're scared, and he came out of Portsmouth, a naval city where you learn early that machinery and men both fail unless somebody checks the bolts. In 1942 he'd been captured amid the collapse of Allied positions in the Dutch East Indies, folded into the same cage system as the sailors from HMS Grasshopper, and delivered to Medan's camp network as just another body to inventory. Whatever his exact trade on the RAF books, surviving summaries wobble between mechanic, ground crew, and the Vega airfield personnel. The culture he carried was the same: make a checklist, anticipate the break, improvise with what you have, And never trust a system to save you because systems are built to save themselves. In Glogoa he expressed that culture with his fingers and Judy's breath, training her the way a fitter trains an engine, by running the same cycle until the noise goes away. Once he had a dog who could go quiet on cue, he began treating her like contraband because that's what she was, a living object the guards could confiscate, kill, or eat, depending on their mood and the supply situation. During movements through Bulawan port and other transfers in the Medan area, he shoved Judy into a rice sack and tied the mouth with twine, then carried the sack the way he carried everything now, casually, with the posture of a man who is trying to look uninteresting. A sack isn't just a bag, it's an engineered problem: restricted airflow, rising temperature, concentrated smell, and a thin wall that amplifies every panic scratch into an accusation. He solved it the way he'd solve a vibration fault on an aircraft, by controlling variables, choosing sacks that weren't damp and moldy, keeping the knot loose enough to leak air without gaping, practicing short stays inside the sack in the hut before betting her life on it at a checkpoint. The mechanism was crude but real. If the dog learns that silence brings release and release brings breathing, she will suppress the urge to thrash even when her nervous system screams at her to escape. The camp rewarded that kind of training with more problems, because in late 1942 Judy went into heat and then whelped inside captivity, producing 5 puppies in a world where men were dying of dysentery and malaria and nobody had spare calories for romance. That litter is not a sentimental detail, it's physiology under siege. Pregnancy and lactation demand energy, protein, and relative safety, and Judy had to scavenge enough and be sheltered enough to cycle and deliver while living among starvation rations and guard violence. Most accounts agree the puppy's fate was grim. One was given away, the others died or vanished, which is exactly what you'd expect in a forced labor system where a pup is just soft meat with a heartbeat. Williams turned one surviving puppy into leverage by physically carrying it to the Japanese commandant, identified in most retellings as Colonel Bono, and using the puppy like a bribe you can't pretend not to see. Some versions paint the meeting as alcohol-slick persuasion, with sake and conversation loosening a signature, others keep it brutally transactional, puppy traded for paper. The stable core is bureaucratic and insane. Williams walked away with Judy registered as a prisoner of war at Glogoa under the designation 81A, and that number would later reappear in metal and museum records because he understood that paper was protection in a place where flesh wasn't. Registration didn't make her safe, it made her legible, and legibility changes how violence has to justify itself. The Japanese camp system ran on lists, roll calls, work parties, punishments, death tallies, and even when those lists lied, they created friction against impulsive killing because somebody upstream might ask why the numbers changed. By pushing Judy into that accounting machine, Williams gave her the same thin shield the men had, not mercy, but paperwork that required a pretext. When a sentry raised a rifle or lifted a boot, Williams could physically point at the register like a talisman and force the guard to choose between a quick act of cruelty and the slower nuisance of explaining it. That is how power works in bureaucracies everywhere, not just in prison camps. You can do almost anything if you can file it, and you can prevent almost anything if you can make filing it annoying. In a place like Glogoa, 81 wasn't dignity, it was a speed bump in front of a killing impulse. That speed bump mattered most when the war began to bend. On the 10th of January, 1945, a B-29 bomber flew over Sumatra, an event survivors remembered precisely because it was one of the first unmistakable signs that Allied air power had reached what felt like a sealed world. Prisoners looked up, guards looked up, and then the guards looked back down at the prisoners with a new kind of anger, the kind that arrives when strategic control weakens and local control tries to compensate by tightening the screws. After that overflight, accounts say the Japanese became more irritable and punitive, and the camp's violence shifted from routine degradation into jittery overreaction. In spring 1945, when a guard beat a prisoner and Judy intervened the way dogs do, body first, teeth second, no speechifying, she took a shot or a strike that left her grazed, bleeding, and limping in a world with no veterinary kit. Grazed sounds gentle until you picture the mechanics: skin torn, formatted with blood, fly attention, parasite exposure, and infection risk in heat that accelerates bacterial growth. Williams treated the wound with whatever he could scrounge: water he should have drunk, cloth that should have been clothing, attention he should have conserved, pressing a makeshift dressing down while she shuddered under his hands, because in a camp where humans were being deliberately stripped of humanity, he kept choosing to spend humanity on a dog. By July 1945, compassion had become a logistics problem with a deadline. The place was the Pekanbaru forced labor system in central Sumatra, tied to the railway the Japanese were driving through jungle between Pekanbaru and Muaro, about 220 kilometers of track bed built by starving men under guard. Japan's supply lines were collapsing, rations were tightening, and the guard's logic simplified into the oldest arithmetic on Earth. Bodies are meat, meat is calories, calories are control. Survivors later said it plainly, plans were made to kill Judy for food, and nothing about that is melodrama when you've watched many insects to stay upright. Williams didn't argue morality with a rifle. He worked the only margin he had left, which was time of day, and he turned Judy's survival into a daily protocol executed under the gaze of men who would have eaten her. Every morning in that last summer he walked her to the jungle edge, kept his posture loose, and sent her into cover with a cue that the record can't pin down. Some say whistle, some imply a hand signal, some suggest a soft phrase, but the behavior is consistent across testimonies. Daylight was when the guards searched, when their eyes were sharp enough to notice a moving shape, and when a dog's sudden bark could trigger punishment for everyone within reach. Night was when exhaustion blunted vigilance and a routine could slide under attention. He made Judy disappear in daylight and return in darkness, which reads like magic only if you've never watched a dog learn. The mechanism is conditioning welded to pattern recognition, cue, action, consequence, repeated until the nervous system locks the sequence into habit, and in a camp the consequences are immediate and violent enough to burn learning into muscle. When Judy broke cover at the wrong moment, she risked death. When she came back on cue, she got a scrap, a touch, and the survival of the one human she'd attached her world to. The jungle itself offered no kindness, it offered concealment with teeth. Around Pekanbaru the cover was dense, the ground hosted biting insects and leeches, and heat stress accumulated fast in a European-bred pointer whose coat was built for a different latitude. Water access in the camp was controlled, so dehydration waited for any animal left outside the fence line, and the humidity turned every breath into work. Judy had to navigate by smell and memory without blundering into a patrol, and she had to accept that the boundary of safety was not a place but a sound, a whisper, a low call from Williams near the fence line. That might mean, come, or might mean, trap, if a guard had noticed. That kind of trust isn't sentimental, it's the end product of a nervous system tuned over years to the rhythms of human threat, responding to microcues in tone and timing the way she once responded to the clink of a food tin on a ship. Surrender arrived as paperwork before it arrived as bodies. Japan announced it on the 15th of August, 1945, but in remote forced labor camps news didn't move by radio so much as by rumor, guard behavior, and the sudden, suspicious pauses in routine when a man with a rifle starts acting like a man who has lost his script. The prisoners in Sumatra didn't hear a speech, they watched faces. They watched guards stop shouting for a few hours, watched work parties reorganize without explanation, watched the violence shift from confident to frantic, which is what happens when the people doing the beating realize the world might soon ask them to answer for it. Williams still walked Judy to the jungle edge during those days because no announcement changes hunger, and hunger is what makes a dog into meat. He waited through late August with the same rigid schedule, calling her back in the dark while the camp held its breath, because in a system built on uncertainty the only thing you can control is your own procedure. On the 4th of September, 1945, British forces reached the Pekanbaru camps, and liberation arrived not as a choir of angels but as boots on mud and the unlocking of gates. Men who hadn't seen a friendly uniform in years stood up too fast, swayed, and grabbed posts to keep their balance while medical officers and troops looked around at bodies that were closer to anatomy diagrams than soldiers. Williams moved first the way he always moved in crisis. He located Judy. He called, she appeared thin and wary out of the brush, and he ran his hands down her ribs like he was checking damage on an airframe, counting bones through fur and feeling for fresh wounds. Survivors later anchored her captivity with a date range that's absurd on its face and still true, roughly 3 years and 5 months as a prisoner, from the 17th of March, 1942, when Padang fell and the group was captured into Medan's system, to the 4th of September, 1945 liberation in Sumatra. She was described as emaciated and weak but alive, and those words are clinical because the biology is clinical. A medium-sized pointer needs roughly 1,000 calories a day to maintain weight, and the men feeding her were themselves living on rations often estimated between 600 and 800 calories, mostly rice, which means Judy's intake was inconsistent, scavenged, and guaranteed to be inadequate. Liberation created a new failure mode that doesn't get the dramatic music it deserves, refeeding. When you've starved long enough, sudden rich food can shock the system, and even without using medical jargon you can understand the mechanics by watching what the body does: vomit, diarrhea, weakness, collapse, when it gets too much too fast. Williams didn't celebrate with a feast, he fed Judy carefully, small amounts of whatever the liberators could spare, and he watched her gut the way he'd watched her breath in a sack, because survival after starvation is a process, not a switch. Med teams triaged men with malaria, dysentery, and edema, and nobody was assigning a veterinarian to an English pointer, so her aftercare stayed improvised, water rationed, scraps scrounged, rest stolen in the gaps between transport orders. In those days the camp didn't dissolve into freedom, it dissolved into logistics, and logistics is where animals get lost. Singapore became the next staging ground, a city that had fallen in February 1942 and now, in September 1945, filled with returning prisoners, medical staff, and the debris of occupation. Williams moved through it like a man carrying both his own survival and a dog's into a bureaucracy that was trying to restore order with forms and schedules, and he kept Judy physically close because proximity had become his only guarantee. Hospitals in Singapore processed ex-POWs through wards and ration lines, and Judy did what dogs do in rooms full of damaged humans. She walked between cots, nudged hands with her muzzle, and lay down where a man's tremor needed something warm to press against. Leonard "Len" Williams, one of the grasshopper survivors whose later oral history sits in the Imperial War Museum, described Judy's presence as moral in a form you didn't have to explain. She didn't demand coherent narratives, she just existed, and that existence cut through the hierarchy of rank and the guilt of who survived. In a war zone turned medical hub, a dog became an unofficial therapy tool before anyone gave that concept a grant and a clipboard. Then peace arrived wearing its second uniform, regulation. In late 1945, repatriation plans for POWs hardened into ship schedules, and the troopship SS Antinor was slated for early 1946 departures from Singapore. In January 1946, a notice went up forbidding animals on troop transports, pinned to a board with the casual authority of a clerk who has never slept in a camp. The rule makes epidemiological sense in the abstract, moving animals across continents spreads disease, and it makes emotional sense to nobody who has spent 3 years treating separation as a death sentence. Williams and the other ex-POWs didn't debate policy, they did what they'd done under the Japanese, which was treat Judy as contraband cargo. They physically got her aboard Antinor, likely in February 1946, using the same skills they'd refined in Medan, concealment, timing, and group discipline. For the first 2 to 3 days at sea they hid her under Williams' bunk, and that hiding was a procedural masterpiece built by men who had learned how to keep secrets under torture. Lookouts took shifts in the passageway, listening for approaching boots and watching for the wrong officer's face, while another man slipped Judy toward the galley at all fouls to scavenge scraps and let her relieve herself without leaving evidence in a compartment. A ship is a terrible place to hide an animal because sound carries through thin bulkheads, ventilation drags sent down corridors, and a single startled yelp can summon authority faster than any radio. They managed the risk with the same method they used to survive roll calls, coordination, silence, and a shared refusal to crack. When a group of men who have been systematically dehumanized chooses to endanger themselves to protect a dog, that isn't sentimental, it's a collective decision to remain human. Once Antinor was well underway, the situation flipped, not because the rule evaporated but because enforcement at sea becomes expensive. Someone informed the crew and officers, and the officers had a menu of options that all tasted bad: throw the dog overboard, turn the ship around, or quietly allow a violation because you can't afford the moral cost of pretending you never saw it. Judy's status changed from hidden liability to celebrated mascot with a speed that is almost funny if you ignore the stakes, and on deck she walked among men who had forgotten what it felt like to move without a guard shouting. The route is described in broad strokes in surviving summaries: Singapore to Colombo, through Suez, then on toward Britain, and the voyage took roughly 10 weeks, long enough for a dog to become a moving landmark on a ship full of haunted bodies. She visited bunks, leaned into hands, and accepted scraps that in another timeline would have been used to build muscle back onto the men. In this one, they spent calories on her because she had become their proof of continuity. Liverpool received her in late April 1946, not with a parade but with the British state's most sincere love language, public health policy. Officials herded Judy into quarantine because Britain's anti-rabies system did not care how many torpedoes she'd survived or how many camps she'd outlasted, it cared about incubation periods and population risk. The record spine places her entering a 6-month quarantine in May 1946, in kennels in Surrey, and staying there through November 1946. Which is the kind of sentence that sounds ordinary until you remember she'd spent most of the previous 4 years behind wire. The epidemiological rationale is blunt: rabies can incubate long enough that you don't gamble on an animal of unknown exposure history, especially in a country trying to rebuild and not interested in a preventable outbreak. The cruelty is biographical. Judy survived capture, forced labor, and starvation, and then peace put her behind mesh again, this time with paperwork insisting it was for her own good. Accounts include the detail that Williams had to wait a week before seeing her because regulations governed visitation, a small administrative torment that lands hard when your last 3 years taught you separation equals death. Institutions don't wait for nervous systems to recover before they schedule applause. On the 3rd of May, 1946, while quarantine still loomed, the PDSA staged a formal Dickin Medal presentation in Cadogan Square, London, with Viscount Tarbert officiating on behalf of the returned POW Association and officials doing the careful choreography of honor. Somebody lifted the ribbon and settled the bronze medallion against Judy's chest, a physical object designed to mimic human military gravitas, about 1 3/8 inches across, stamped PDSA for gallantry, and the motto, "We also serve," hung on stripes of green, dark brown, and pale blue to symbolize land, sea, and air. The citation language praised magnificent courage and endurance in Japanese prison camps and credited her with maintaining morale and saving lives through intelligence and watchfulness, a deliberate threading of different rescue stories into one official narrative without forcing bureaucrats to pick which incident mattered. Williams stood near enough to touch her, because ceremonies can be loud and dogs read crowd noise as threat, and the act of placing a medal on an animal is always, underneath the pomp, a human attempt to translate a non-human life into human categories. A month later, on the 8th of June, 1946, the public story machine did something both technically banal and culturally deranged. It broadcast Judy's bark on BBC Radio during victory celebrations, often described as the first dog bark sent worldwide. Engineers placed a microphone in front of her, a diaphragm that turns pressure waves into electrical signal, and that signal rode transmitters into the ether before receivers across Britain turned it back into sounding kitchens that still smelled of ration cooking. The bark itself carried no politics, no gratitude, no coherent message. It was a territorial signal meant for attention and proximity. Yet the BBC treated it as proof that something survived intact enough to be noisy, and post-war listeners let themselves believe a dog's vocal cords could stand in for the unspeakable. The comedy is the mechanism, a national trauma processed through a pressure wave, while the seriousness is the desperation. People needed a sound that didn't ask questions. Honor piled up in ways that made Judy legible to organizations that only know how to honor by enrolling. The returned POW Association made her an honorary life member and, in some accounts, physically handed over a membership card, which is not a cute footnote so much as a statement that men who had been categorized as captives recognized an animal as part of their category. Newspapers and clubs then did what newspapers and clubs do. They inflated her into a cross-branch joke, calling her Leading Aircraftswoman Judy, or Petty Officer Judy, ranks that were never official but revealed the urge to squeeze her into the uniform grid of human status. Williams didn't correct every absurd title. He clipped more tags onto her collar, letting metal do the translation work. The nameplate engraved Judy, Animal VC, sat against her fur, and other tags accumulated like a dog-sized filing system. PDSA Allied Forces Mascot Club 1180, a silver tail waggers club, tag stamped for valor with a membership number, and miniature ribbon bars that turned a neck into a campaign display. It's funny until you realize those tags are evidence, material proof that institutions, charities, and veterans groups tried to admit an animal into the moral economy of service because they couldn't stomach the alternative, which is pretending she was just property. When Judy finally left quarantine in late 1946, Williams physically collected her like a man reclaiming a vital organ. He signed whatever forms the kennel demanded, attached a lead, and walked her out through gates that opened without guards shouting, a mundane act that would have felt like science fiction back at Pekanbaru. They returned to Portsmouth, and in July 1946, the 22nd of July by one stable account, Williams' IF service formally ended, the demobilization process reducing years of survival to a date stamp and a discharge. Some narratives even say Judy was demobbed, which is an absurd verb for a dog and still accurate in the way bureaucracies love. Her official war identity was being wound down by paperwork into a civilian life. He took her into parks and streets where no one carried rifles, and he introduced her not as a mascot but as a living companion who had slept beside men in camps and kept coming back from the jungle on cue. If peace was supposed to restore normality, it began for them with the shock of quiet. Portsmouth in 1946 and 1947 offered a different kind of duty, and Williams carried it out by physically taking Judy to other people's grief. She appeared at PDSA events to raise funds, her medal and tags clinking like a tiny ceremonial chain, and she visited families of POWs who didn't return, entering living rooms where photographs sat on mantels like permanent roll calls. Judy would walk in, sniff, and then lie down at someone's feet, offering presents without interrogation, which is a clinical mercy in a culture trained to swallow emotion. Men who couldn't cry in uniform could scratch behind a dog's ear. and women who had spent years waiting could put their hand on a warm body and feel, briefly, that the waiting had a shape. Williams didn't narrate their trauma in those rooms. He held Judy's lead and let her do the only honest work available, which was to exist without demanding explanation. In 1948, Williams put the medals and the collar into luggage and left Britain for Tanganyika in British East Africa, joining the post-war groundnut farming scheme that promised agricultural abundance and collided with ecology and logistics like a bureaucrat walking into a swamp. He loaded Judy onto whatever transport carried him, ship, plane, the details blur in the common retellings, and brought her to Nachingway, a place remote enough that the war's paperwork became irrelevant and the landscape itself stopped resembling a camp. There she did the most radical thing a war animal can do, she roamed. She ran through scrub, chased off baboons and snakes near the work camp, and explored a semi-wild environment that offered danger without malice, even as her body carried the wear of starvation, wounds, and age. If you want a mechanistic picture of what retirement looks like in a dog, picture joints that have been underfed for years still choosing to sprint when a predator moves. Life still insisted on biology. Judy produced another litter in Africa, 9 puppies by one set of summaries, meaning she still had enough physiological reserve, despite wartime deprivation, to cycle and whelp again. Williams built a nest space and guarded it the way he'd guarded everything that mattered since 1942, using whatever cloth and shelter the camp offered, because a dog giving birth is vulnerable in the simplest physical way: reduced mobility, high energy demand, and a strong drive to protect that can attract attention from humans and animals. Those puppies aren't just a happy detail, they're evidence of stubborn resilience, the body's refusal to stop trying even after it has been used as a tool. For a while, the story allowed itself to look like a normal human and dog life, only set against African heat instead of Portsmouth drizzle. Late 1949 stripped away the last illusion that survival equals escape. Judy disappeared for 9 days, and Williams searched the bush around Nachingway with the kind of frantic, methodical pattern a handler uses when he has been trained by war to assume the worst. Local villagers found her hiding sick in a hut, a behavior that reads like instinct. An animal in pain seeks cover, reduces exposure, and conserves energy because movement becomes cost. A veterinarian, some retellings place the surgery in Nairobi, others imply a more local intervention, operated to remove a mammary tumor, likely cancer, and the mechanics of that are grimly standard. Anesthesia risk in an older dog, excision with limited imaging, and the ever-present possibility that malignant cells have already moved. Mammary tumors in female dogs are common and often malignant, and by the time one is large enough to drive a dog into hiding, metastasis is not a melodramatic fear but a statistical expectation. Judy rallied briefly after the operation, and then the disease returned with the blunt efficiency of biology. On the 17th of February, 1950, in Tanganyika, Williams made the decision to have her euthanized, and comedy leaves the room because this is one of the few clean mercies humans can offer animals. He took her to the person who would administer the injection, held her body steady, and let controlled medicine end pain that had become the only stable output left. The calendar itself carried a bitter resonance. Mid-February was also when she had been wounded in 1942 during the bombing and sinking of HMS Grasshopper in the Linga archipelago, a coincidence that doesn't need mysticism to feel heavy when you've lived through it. A dog who had survived bullets, hunger, forced labor, and years of hypervigilance died the way most animals should be allowed to die, without violence, without spectacle, with a human hand present and a body finally permitted to stop. Williams didn't outsource the aftermath to an institution, he did the work. He buried Judy at Nachingway and made the grave into an archive with his own hands. Accounts describe him wrapping her in his RAF tunic or coat, repurposing a uniform into a shroud, then digging and placing and packing earth until the body was no longer visible, because burial is physical labor and grief is often the act of refusing to leave the work undone. He erected a brass plaque and hammered it into place, forcing a metal surface to carry what paper might not. Later photographs and descriptions preserve the plaque's brutal specificity. English pointer, born in Shanghai in February 1936, died February 1950, wounded the 14th of February, 1942, bombed and sunk with Grasshopper in the Linga archipelago, torpedoed on SS Van Werwijk in the Malacca Straits on the 26th of June, 1944. Japanese prisoner of war from March 1942 to August 1945. It listed a travel itinerary like a shipping manifest: China, Ceylon, Java, England, Egypt, Burma, Singapore, Malaya, Sumatra, East Africa, and it included the line that turns legend into documentation: prisoner of war 81A Globoa, Medan. Whatever the camp register did or did not preserve, that number survived because Williams refused to let it dissolve into a nice story and chose to make it metal. Human beings, unfortunately and beautifully, do not let a good narrative die quietly, especially when it comes with a medal you can photograph. In 1973, Edwin Varley published the Judy story, one of the early compilations that pulled her back into public attention as post-war memory slid into anniversary culture. Later writers reopened the file with fresh language, Damian Lewis in 2014 with Judy, A Dog in a Million, Robert Weintraub in 2015 with No Better Friend, each turning the same events into different pacing, different emphases, different degrees of rhetorical heat. Those books didn't invent Judy out of nothing, they worked from testimonies, press accounts, and surviving artifacts, but each retelling shaped the silhouette of what mattered, because narrative is always an editorial tool. Meanwhile, the physical objects kept doing their quiet work, the Dickin medal, the collar engraved, Judy, Animal VC, the tags that turned a neck into a register, and the plaque hammered in Tanzania that refused to let the story float off into pure myth. In 2006, those artifacts crossed another institutional threshold when Judy's Dickin medal and collar were donated to the Imperial War Museum and displayed in its exhibition The Animals' War. A curator handled the collar the way historians handle fragile truth, carefully, with gloves, measuring and cataloguing instead of caressing, and a museum number replaced the intimacy of a family relic. That matters because it's late, 60 years after Cadogan Square. The objects were stored and treated as evidence rather than as souvenirs, which makes it harder for a skeptic to dismiss Judy as folklore. Museum glass does something bureaucracies have always done, it makes a claim by controlling access, telling you this object is real enough to protect, and therefore the story attached to it deserves attention. The exhibit didn't just display heroism, it displayed chain of custody, and chain of custody is the adult version of belief. Commemoration is also where nonsense breeds, because once a story becomes valuable, people want the value without the discipline. In 2015, around the 70th anniversary of VJ Day, the UK Ministry of Defence highlighted Judy and used language that drifted into inflation, including claims that she saved thousands of lives, which reads like a press office mistaking magnitude for truth. The record supports specific heroism, water found in February 1942, rescues during the Van Werwijk disaster in June 1944, morale effects described by survivors, an injury defending a prisoner, survival through years of captivity, and none of that requires imaginary arithmetic. Thousands isn't an evidentiary number, it's a marketing mood, and it invites the rest of the myth kit to crawl in behind it. Once you start selling a story, somebody will offer you lurid accessories, tells that her POW number was tattooed in her ear, or that she was going to be skinned to make a drum, and those details don't appear in the most grounded sources and don't sit naturally with what we know about how camps functioned. The consequence of that drift is not just intellectual embarrassment, it's erasure, because every invented horror garnish pulls attention away from the real, documented horror that already happened to human bodies and animal bodies without needing embellishment. The harder truth is quieter and sits in the archives where people do boring work. Judy doesn't leave diaries, so the story leans on human testimony like Leonard Williams' oral history and on physical artifacts like the collar and medal that can be weighed and photographed. Camp documentation from the Japanese side is fragmentary, and their absence is itself a constraint that should shape how confidently anyone speaks, because historical precision requires admitting where the paper burns out. Yet the existence of 81A on a grave plaque in Natchingway, and the matching designations attached to her collar and museum files, puts a nail through the center of the tale. Someone, somewhere, wrote that number down and treated it as a real classification in a real system. You can hear the bureaucracy in the phrase, prisoner of war, but you can also hear a human refusal to let an animal be dismissed as scenery. When Williams hammered that plaque into place, he wasn't just mourning, he was filing. In July 2020, the Royal Navy announced that Judy had been chosen to represent naval dogs in a planned National Military Working Dogs Memorial at Bryn Ford in North Wales, and by 2022 the memorial unveiled for life-size bronze dog statues representing different services, with Judy standing in for the Navy's cross-species contribution to war. A sculptor turned muscle and rib into fixed metal, freezing a body that once had to vanish into jungle in daylight and return at night on a whisper cue. Bronze is a strange endpoint for a creature whose whole wartime survival depended on flexibility, stealth, and movement, but commemoration always trades motion for permanence. The memorial doesn't show the heat stress in central Sumatra, the leeches, the rice sack airlessness, or the quarantine mesh. It shows a dog upright and noble because that's what humans can bear to look at in public. The full arc runs through systems, not through sentiment, a register at Glogoa, a hiding protocol at Pekanbaru, a shipping rule on a notice board in Singapore, quarantine kennels in Surrey, a medal in Cadogan Square, a microphone at the BBC, a brass plaque in Natchingway, a display case at the Imperial War Museum, and a bronze casting in North Wales. At every stage a human hand does something to a dog's body: feeds, hides, bandages, registers, cages, decorates, transports, euthanizes, buries, catalogues, casts, and each action makes her more survivable and less free in the same motion. Judy never consented to enlistment, never read a regulation, never understood why a number mattered, but she endured every human procedure anyway because her nervous system was built to attach, to follow, to return when called. In the end, the most honest monument is not the medal or the statue but the act of counting, one man from Portsmouth taking a hammer to a plaque in Tanganyika and making the world admit, in cold metal, that an animal was recruited into catastrophe and numbered like property, and that refusing to forget the number was the closest thing to justice he could still physically do.